celebrate without too much bloodshed the 100th anniversary of the Norwegian Synod, our little synod. For this anniversary, we had a medallion struck. The Evangelical Lutheran Synod, there's a picture of the Lime Creek Church on the front of it, proclaiming the wonders God has done, and then the dates 1918 to 2018. And we would like to give each one of you one of these medallions.
That's marvelous.
How many do you have?
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That is tremendous.
Thanks so much.
I love those things.
And so that's what
We were talking up here a little while ago. In all these 51 years of Reformation Lectures, one of the things that I believe the Reformation Lectures has done most for us is that it's provided us with a tremendous body of literature. All of the Reformation Lectures have been published in the Lutheran Synod quarterly. I think the only exception is Heiko Oberman, who wouldn't give us a printed text, but we did get the videos. In any case, I think that when these lectures are edited and published, I think that Lutheran Synod Quarterly is probably going to be one of the best ones that we've had. And so we thank all three of you for that. Now, if Pastor Firkenstead had read a little faster this morning, maybe we would have had time for a couple of questions then. But since he was reading so slowly, we'll take some, for the first 15 minutes or so today, well, let's just take the opportunity to send questions or comments toward the last lecture, toward Pastor Firkenstead. So the mics should be set up back there. And if anybody wants to comment or ask a question, do I see? Are these people coming in, or do they want to speak?
Well, since they're late, they must speak.
Any questions of Pastor Firkenstead?
There we go, on the left.
Okay.
I have a question for Pastor Firkenstead. And I might have missed if you had it in discussion this morning. You talked a lot about Landstad's hymn book and its influence. You didn't talk about the Synod's hymn book or the Synod's revised hymn book that Corin and Visa were editors for. Did you want to talk about that at all?
The Synod's hymn book would have come about in
1874.
I was going to say 72. Would have come about as the American publication itself, and yes, that would have also had that great influence on the Synod and upon its culture itself, as it was that first publication itself. I didn't refer specifically here to those because really of the trilogy itself that had been set up. Landstad's hymn book would have been, and Landstad's time and Lindemann's tunes would have been 1860s, and so for the Norwegian Synod proper, that was not immediately that strong influence. The later immigrants that came would have been much more familiar with Lindemann and Landstad. That would be much more common than in the United Church itself, one of the three synods that entered into the 1917 merger. Also for those merged synods would have been much more familiar the revised liturgy that came out in Norway in 1889. Would have been much more familiar to those bodies themselves. The Landstad hymn book and the revision of the liturgy in Norway from the 1880s would have been much more dominant in the Lutheran hymnary that came out in 1913. But of course, yes, Corin and Visa were very, very important in the 1874 hymnary in the United States, and then the English hymn book in 1913.
Yeah.
There were some changes that were taking place at that point in time.
I think the Synod hymn book didn't, I think they were a little bit stronger in the chorale tradition and holding to more traditional language. The Landstad had updated the poetry, and in some places was not as strong theologically. It was still very strong theologically, but I think the Synod's hymn book was even stronger in some ways, and that's why they put out a hymn book right away so that they would have a stronger theology possible in the hymns. And I think it's interesting also to note which is the hymn book they brought over with them. The early immigrants probably brought Kingo's hymn book, I think. There were a couple others that were around, but Kingo's hymn book was such a powerful influence, and his hymns are much more common in the Synod hymn book than in Landstad, although there are a lot in Landstad as well. How about the rhythmic?
Definitely so. Kingo's, Guldeberg's would have been the other hymn book itself, but yes, that Kingo tradition was much stronger in the Synod than it would have been in later editions after Lindemann, after Landstad, and with the later immigrants.
Yeah. How about the rhythmic chorale book that was put out by people like Corin, his daughter, and of that? They were trying to go back to the rhythmic form of the hymns. What are your thoughts about that?
I don't have too many thoughts on it. Corin, however, was a great proponent of going back to that rhythmic chorale. But that would have been very consistent with what the Norwegian Synod itself had known, in spite of the fact that Lindemann would have been his instructor at Christiania.
Yeah, I think the popular opinion that they were used to singing somewhat more straightened out chorales, they just, that had such a powerful influence, and so the rhythmic chorales never won among the Norwegians, like you were saying, and that's exactly right. Interesting that we have those two traditions in our synod now that kind of converge and work together, I think. I think they both have value. Some people disdain the straightened out chorales. That's a pietistic thing and all of this, and it's not necessarily so. I don't call Bach a pietist, and he wrote the straightened melodies, but he could do all kinds of things with the harmonies that were very interesting. And so they had both of those influences. There was one more thing. I'll come back if I think of it.
Yeah, we'll get around to it.
Craig, I'd like to ask too, along those lines, could you comment a little bit about the 1913 hymnary? That it really was a unionizing, it was a union hymn book, and isn't it kind of paradoxical that we hung on to it for so long? Part that had its faults because there was some kind almost crass pietistic hymns in there, like the hymn that the seminary students sang yesterday, "O Father, may thy word prevail." Now, there was one line in it, that the last line in the first verse, is it? That says, how weak the power and evidence in the original version. And Norman A. Madsen Sr. changed that to how weak the power in evidence, which quite changes the meaning. But could you talk about it as a unionistic hymn book?
Well, very much was. Even the foreword of the 1913 hymnary spoke of the fact that hopefully this is a book that encourages and helps bring about the union that was going to be taking place 4 years later when the merger itself took place. And so it was designed as that specifically. Often been pointed out, too, that there are not hymns on eternal election in that hymn book. That would have been very controversial, very difficult to put in at that point in time. However, if I remember correctly, it was not long after the merger took place that the ELS already began to have a call for her own hymn book, that really didn't want to continue to use that hymn book, but we should have something of our own. Well, size, time, finances were not going to allow that to take place. And so then what happens is over the years you have various supplements that take place, various attempts at all of this that take place. The Lutheran hymnal is going to come in, and that changes directions, and of course immediately again calls for a replacement.
The resolution for the synodical conference to publish a hymn book came from the ELS.
Came from the ELS.
38 or 39?
Came from the ELS. It fell basically on deaf ears in the 1930s to publish a hymn book. A few years after that, Missouri Synod decides it's time to publish a hymn book. They form a worship or the committee to do this and basically say the other synods, now do you want to come and join us? And so yes, the impetus came out of the ELS. It died or was ignored, however the case might be. Missouri Synod then picks up upon it and puts the call into it. And there's some very interesting stories about the publication of the Lutheran hymnal, Norman Madsen, and some of the frustrations from the committee itself, dealing with the committee, and changes that Polak really made to the hymn book after final approvals were given. Unilaterally. The ELS was surprised to see the hymnal in the form that it came out.
So were many Missourians.
Back here?
Thank you for your paper. One of the things that kind of struck me with regards to the debates about the merger and the uproar and all of that is a lot of it revolves around, of course, the phrase in tudo fide, which Gerhard uses it, and of course in the explanation. So a lot of it is revolving around church tradition, traditional language used by the church towards the doctrine of election. And you talk in the paper about our hermeneutic of Scripture interprets Scripture as being one of the main principles of the ELS hermeneutic, which of course is correct. But one thing along with that is also the role of the fathers, not only in our understanding of Scripture, but also how those things have then guided various doctrinal controversies over the course of time, even the founding of our synod. What would you say is kind of the main role of the fathers, I guess, from 1917, 1918, going through today, and when it comes to our scriptural hermeneutic?
Buch-Harstead himself, at the time of the merger, wanted that force to go back to Scripture interprets Scripture and not letting the fathers themselves be the overriding factor in what was taking place. In other words, not appealing back to Pontoppidan, not appealing back to Gerhard, but allowing Scripture itself to interpret Scripture. And I think that's really, truly colored things as we went forward. As the dissolution of the Synodical Conference was approaching, it wasn't the fathers that were being gone back to, it was that Scripture itself, and Scripture interprets Scripture. So I think it's continued forward in that way.
So what role do you see the fathers as playing within the hermeneutics? Of course, it is sola scriptura, but it seems to me within the ELS, we don't have Wauwatosa theology. We don't have some of the other strains that exist within other flavors of confessional Lutheranism. What has maintained that more traditional patristic sense of confessional Lutheranism within the ELS?
What has maintained it?
Correct.
Well, that is going back, I think, still to that influence of that study of coming back from Opior and allowing the Scriptures to speak for themselves, and that has so colored us and so influenced us that I think there is maybe the fear of getting away from that scriptural principle itself. Over the years, Professor Teigen once made the statement that the best way not to become a synergist, I believe, is to have a fear of becoming one. And that same thing somewhat applies to our hermeneutical principle itself, that we do not want to depart from Scripture itself. And having that desire not to depart, or that fear of departing from it, has so colored us to keep us in that way.
Along with maintaining the old slogan, "De stat scrivet." It
Yes.
stands written so that has been on our literature year after year after year, and it's pretty hard to lose sight of it.
Tim Schmaling from the seminary. As long as the intuitu fide question came up, Lutheran Orthodoxy gets a black eye in this, and I have a certain vested interest in that, as most of you know. Did anyone, Cora and Walter come back and they do defend Gerhard on this? Did anyone really on either side fully come to understand what the dogmaticians were really getting at? There's only 3 maybe monographs on what Lutheran Orthodoxy really meant by ex provisa fide and intuitu fide. And sometimes we kind of throw these out, and sometimes has anyone really done justice to what Orthodoxy meant with that and given them their due so that they don't just get, become knocked out real easily?
To my knowledge, probably not. I think you're probably correct. It has received such a negative sense, and in America received such a negative application that I don't know myself, I'm not aware that study would have really taken place. Possibly Pastor Brenner would, or Professor Brenner might have a better feel of that, though.
I don't know of any specific studies, but I think even in the great age of orthodoxy, I believe Kaloff warned against the expression because it could be misunderstood. And some of the later representatives of the age of orthodoxy, Hullitz and Bayer, if they weren't synergists, they were awfully close to it.
I think they were, yeah.
Yeah, I do too, but I read other things where people are defending them, trying to put the best construction on everything, but I think they fell into synergism. And again, I think it goes back to the fear of Calvinism. They in Germany, with Calvinism making inroads into Lutheran lands, that was the big enemy. But I mean, the phrase "intuitu fide" was first used by the Arminians.
Right.
So why they ever picked up on that, I don't know.
I just wonder sometimes the subtlety in those Aristotelian categories. I think the more we dig into that, I think we get a better picture of them if we really can put ourselves and learn the categories. I still think pastorally they shouldn't have gone there. It's like they didn't use the three cause language in the Formula of Concord, but up to the last draft of the Formula of Concord, they use those three parts of conversion. And when Melanchthon uses that language, he talks about the will being a material that's passive. He does make synergistic statements other places. Yes. There's Gnasia Lutherans that use this, and by the time you get to the Formula of Concord, they realize this wasn't the best pastoral move. Yep. And in my mind, Lutheran Orthodoxy, this wasn't the best pastoral move. It wasn't as close to Scripture as you pointed out, Dr. Brenner, in your own writing. But I want to give them a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt. I think we haven't always done that sometimes when we tell this history. So.
In that regard also, and it's something that I've kind of wondered, and that is when we speak of intuitu fide, people like Gerhard would have regarded the fact that God does see that faith at the end of our life, but gives God all credit for bringing us to faith, and preserving us in that faith through the means of grace. And so is there a spot where that phrase does speak of means of grace, and we have failed to give it its due course of the importance of the means of grace due to how it has become misused?
Okay, then if either of the speakers have a question or a response to Pastor Frickinson, let's start with Dr. Brenner.
Yeah, I appreciated the question earlier on hermeneutics, because I really think that's really the issue of the last couple centuries in America and American Lutheranism. So I really appreciated your remarks on page 23. I'm wondering if you would maybe want to offer any opinions on some of the things we read in Lutheran circles today. Now, it's legitimate to draw inferences from Scripture. That's good theology. Problem is when people start drawing inferences from inferences of Scripture. And I'm wondering if you would have any comments on that.
Oh, is that a broad statement? Well, that is very much what we find along the way, and contemporary Christianity, should you say, amongst us does not allow Scripture to really interpret Scripture. It does become inferences. It is so much feel-good theology that is there that we simply are not being directed back to Scripture itself. Even in sermonizing, so often that can happen where one is giving an exposition rather than speaking of what the Scriptures may have to say and pointing out God's will in a certain spot. And so very much, as you say, that is an issue of contemporary theology that we face day by day around us. There happens to be in one of our Minnesota television stations, there's a short little exhortation in the morning that is given. It happens to be based out of one of the churches in the Twin Cities. But it is interesting how it is a very much of a feel-good theology. There is nothing but that along the way. But the morning that struck me was the morning when it ended, and the quotation was, as Michael J. Fox says. And then it went on, and that was the end. And unfortunately, that's where so much of the things around us are coming down to.
Was this in the ELS church?
There's no denomination in the name, and what does that tell you?
Okay,
Yes, thanks. I really appreciated the paper very much. I learned a lot. And that's one of the real upsides always to being part of this event as a Missourian, getting a better feel for the Evangelical Lutheran Synod, understanding its experience, its people. And that's, my own comments about the informal conversations we've had. I think that's been helpful at a number of points. And so my first thing is to offer a little bit of a challenge. On page 26, what you say is true, but there's more to it. The members who form, this is in the point 3, paragraph in the 50th anniversary essay. The members who formed the Missouri and Wisconsin synods immigrated to America largely due to spiritual reasons. Here, I actually believe there's more commonality between the Norwegians and the majority of the Germans who make up the Missouri Synod. The vast majority of Missouri Synod members did not come for spiritual reasons. They came specifically for economic reasons. It's those crazy Saxons that kind of color the entire story of the Missouri Synod. Whereas the other part of the story, and John pointed to it a little bit, the Franconian settlements, the Lea Sendlinge, these are the guys who are out finding the Germans and bringing them into the congregations that then become part of the Missouri Synod, and all of those people are there for non-spiritual reasons. So it's just a little bit of a corrective, but it does then raise the interesting question that still remains out of this, and that is, so then why does Missouri put such a huge emphasis on their schools and the Norwegians don't? So if you could say a little bit more on that, I'd love to hear it.
The reason for immigration, and the reference here is really due to Prussian Union and forcing the start of some of that immigration itself. But yes, if you think especially about the Franconians, you've got a different theory entirely. Someone who isn't here this afternoon commented at noontime that it was a very interesting statement about the Germans and immigration for spiritual reasons and the Norwegian for economic reasons. And he said, we, as a member of Wisconsin Synod, always use that distinction between Missouri and Wisconsin Synod. Professor Brenner's nodding his head. that Wisconsin Synod individuals, or is the view that was much more for economic reasons, and the individuals then sent to gather them together, whereas you think of the Saxons and the spiritual. So it depends on at what point and what era it is that you are truly looking at it. But you do find many of those Missouri Synod churches in particular where the school was built first, and I think that does go back to that Prussian Union and wanting to be able to educate their children in the way of the truth as they feel it should be done, and not having that dictated by the state itself, and rather leaving that to the family, to the church. The Norwegians, that just wasn't the case with the state church of Norway, and they expected that to be transferred to the United States. And anything other than public school was un-American, and there were big debates, even referred to as the school debates, amongst Norwegian Lutherans in the United States. The clergy wanted Christian day schools, the laity did not want them. And so very, very few Christian day schools in the old Norwegian Synod for that reason.
but after the merger, the Little Synod got into the business of Christian elementary education very quickly. In fact, I think they even appointed a school committee at one of the first two conventions.
Of course, the statement of the few schools that existed in the Norwegian Synod at the time of the merger, they all closed shortly thereafter, except for 3 of them that continued within the reorganized Synod. One of which is still in existence today.
Okay, then let's open it up. You can direct questions to any of the speakers. If you have a specific question, say which speaker you are sending your question to. Mark remembered.
I didn't actually, but I wonder if Craig wants to talk, just in this same topic, about the parochial schools, the summer parochial schools, or monthly, whatever, summer schools that were held among the Norwegians.
Many a German pastor in these German congregations we spoke about often was the school teacher. Norwegians didn't have the number of clergy in that regard, and so first of all, we'd say Sunday school developed. This Klokker, it typically also fell to him. One of his tasks, in Norway, one of the tasks of the Klokker was actually to gather the children for confirmation instruction. He would be doing that instruction itself. The pastor would really be doing the examination, but the actual work was being done by the Klokker. In the United States, the lack of clergy amongst Norwegian Lutheran congregations often meant that the pastor would only be in a congregation every few weeks. In the interim time, it was one of the men in the congregation who would gather the children for our equivalent of Sunday school. So something was happening there week by week, but it was not always the service with the pastor. Summer times came, however, and this is where the Norwegian supplemented, we could say, the public school where he had expected that religious instruction was going to be given. There would be a teacher that would likely go from various district to district within a specific congregation using the public school buildings, and for full day instruction, they would be teaching the catechism, they would be teaching Bible history, they would be teaching the Norwegian language and hymnody and all of these things for 1 to 2 weeks of time in the summer, and then he would move onward to another district in the congregation itself. I did say in the summer, it could be broader than that. Some of these would take place during the school year, and in places it has been said in a strong Norwegian community that the public school actually had to close down for those couple weeks when the Norwegian teacher would come because nobody was going to be in the public school. And then at those opportunities, it would be the public school, the one-room school building that the congregation itself would make use of. Summertime, this would end with Barnefest, with Children's Festival, and so this would be the special time at church for the children itself, either at the conclusion of all of this or to take note of it. The one time of the year, by the way, children got to eat first. That's a change from today also.
And something just also in connection with this idea of Norwegian and American, I think the Norwegians and Corin always talked about the Norwegian, our people in this land, our Norwegian people in this American land. So they felt this dual loyalty in some ways. And one of the illustrations of that is the way Norwegians named their animals. The cows and the dogs had Norwegian names because they stayed at home. But the horses sometimes got English names because they went to town and had to interact with American people or whatever. So and that's from Kathleen Stockert's book, Keeping Christmas, I think, or one of her books, I think. Just kind of a fun little fact.
See, so Norwegians did have some fun. Over here.
I'm going to stay with schools, but before that, I got to remind Brenner of something that we always talk about. I think it was my father, your grandfather, and Benken that were at a meeting, and Benken was adamant about some point, and finally said, "Did I make myself clear?" And his grandfather said, "You made yourself very clear, but you haven't cleared yourself." I think it's a famous quote in Wisconsin Synod too, but my father told that years ago. But schools, again, the Norwegians must have had a strong affinity for schools. Bugharst founded 4 academies in North Dakota and Minnesota. And that my question is now the different kinds of schools and what that means. How did an academy differ from a high school? Luther College in the beginning was a 6-year program. It evidently was high school and college all combined. We still have the term academy, not just Lutherans either. We played Wayland Academy in Wisconsin in my high school days. Winnebago Academy. Didn't Martin Luther High School used to be called Martin Luther Academy, Mulbridge Academy? Why that term? And then we can get the Germans in here with gymnasiums too. Now, how does all of this fit together? How different is that from our system?
The Norwegians would have had a whole series of academies throughout the nation itself. Our closest equivalent today would be area Lutheran high schools, but it's not a direct correspondence itself. After the elementary school existed the academy. Level of some of the work in the elementary schools we would consider to be almost terminal at that point in time. And so the academy was almost like the last 2 years of high school, the start of junior college. You'd have some practical things taking place there, business and what have you. Not necessarily the preparatory school for seminary and full-time church work. If you wanted that, you would go to a Lutheran college and be a part of that 6-year program, but not if you were going to be, for example, at Elbert Lee in the Elbert Lee Academy. And so that was preparing people through these Lutheran academies for their life in the church and whatever vocation they are in, but having this Christian training and doing so.
You know, one other thing in that regard, in the around 1920, both before and after, the Norwegian Synod, especially under the leadership of O.M. Norley, published Who's Who. First, there was one done just in Norwegian. It had all the pastors in it, but it didn't have them in alphabetical order, but in the order that they graduated from the seminary. But then later on, one came out, and that's the one that I know Craig and I both use this a lot. It's called Who's Who Among Norwegian American Pastors. And that one is alphabetical, and it's a real treasure trove of material. Now, then there was another one, however, that's not seen so much, and I don't know how many people really know its existence. And that was one that had all of the teachers. Now, that included the teachers who were teaching in the academies and also in the colleges, but there are a lot of people in there, especially women teachers, but some men teachers too, who are not teaching in the academies, but were, some of them might have been those summer school teachers, but I think that there were more than that. So it's not that there were no Christian day schools, but I mean, not on the level of Missouri and Wisconsin.
You probably could have counted those Christian day schools on your hands and feet, under 20 of them along the way. There were not that many of them, but there definitely were schools along the way, and teachers were called from spot to spot and what have you. Where there was a school, Christian day school, that might also be where the Clucker himself took place. Interestingly, reference was made to Pacific Lutheran University today was originally Pacific Lutheran Academy and Business College. And so that kind of tells a little bit of the level also of those academies. But the German gymnasium.
In the Missouri Synod, our two seminaries still existing, both predate the formation of the Synod. What's today Concordia Seminary St. Louis began as a college in 1839 in Perry County, Altenburg in Perry County. And its first class, I forget exactly how many students, it was small, and the youngest student was 5 years old and a girl. It wasn't a seminary as we think of it today in any way, shape, or form. It was a preparatory school. And the hope was ultimately to establish a school of divinity very specifically. And that began to happen as early as 1843 with the reconfiguration of the curriculum there. But still, this is frontier. Things are very, very fluid, both at the Perry County institution at that point, and then our seminary in Fort Wayne, which was founded in 1846. Now, our seminary took its cue from Wilhelm Leah and the quick preparation that he was doing for candidates that did not have any formal, did not have requisite formal training at the gymnasium level in Germany. So he begins to train men for ministry who have missed the boat, if you will. in their window of opportunity to study Greek and Hebrew, to prepare themselves with Latin, and to read the systematicians in a very, very formal way, to begin that process already at what we would call the high school level. Instead, he takes people that are working in very common areas, barrel makers and shoemakers and that kind of stuff, and gives them kind of crams a curriculum down their throat in about a year, and then sends them to America and says, don't be a pastor, be a teacher. So they begin to arrive already in the early part of the 1840s with this minimal training, and they quickly find that even with their approximate year of formal study, that they're better trained than many of the so-called Lutheran pastors that are running around the western frontier at that point in time, for various reasons. And as a result then, when Wyneken and Leah connect during Leah's travels in the early 1840s in Germany, and Wyneken comes back to Fort Wayne, he then begins to train pastors in his parsonage, and then in 1846, Wilhelm Seeler begins the seminary proper as a practical seminary. 2-year curriculum, train men as quickly as possible, but well, and then send them out for service. So no gymnasium at all. And that kind of tradition then carries into the Missouri Synod at its formation in 1847, that we have a practical seminary and a theoretical seminary, as it's called. And so oftentimes we operate with that as, that's how it was. It really wasn't, because there's also a third option that's articulated in the first constitution of our synod, not only a practical and a theoretical seminary, but also kind of the pastor, the resident pastor as mentor for a viable candidate. So that, apprenticeship model that had been practiced in North America well back before Muhlenberg is actually adopted by the Missouri Synod as a legitimate way to prepare men for ministry as well. So you have 3 routes to ministry right from the beginning in the Missouri Synod, one of which is the ideal, the gymnasium leading to the theoretical seminary, and that will become the St. Louis Seminary in 1850 when it transfers up there. The practical seminary, which is much more concise in terms of its preparation, which is designed to capture everybody who doesn't have that formal preparation, and then this idea that you can just take the promising guy and make him into a good pastor, that kind of idea. So those 3 general headings have characterized our synod now and again. We've massaged that and tweaked it and expressed it in all kinds of different forms. We did, there was a time when we really did have a formal system with the preparatory colleges, the senior college when it was operating at full capacity, and then sending men on to the St. Louis Seminary. That's really the one point at which you have kind of the ideal expressed in the Missouri Synod. But even at that point, you still have Springfield functioning to capture everybody else. And you end up with some really interesting results coming out of this. For example, one of my professors at the Fort Wayne Seminary was a man by the name of Heino Kadai, who was Estonian and had come to the United States in the wake of World War II, had gone to Columbia for his undergraduate work, and as a result, could not go to the St. Louis Seminary. So he had to go to Springfield. So you had some people coming with very high academic qualifications through the Springfield system because they hadn't gone through the system as such. So there's these kind of anomalies that regularly occur within the Missouri Synod setting. That finally goes away. In fact, the first person to kind of blow the whole thing up is William Weinrich, Bill Weinrich, if you know him, one of our professors, who gets into St. Louis even though he went to the University of Oklahoma for his undergraduate degree. And that's the end of it. That's the end of the Missouri Synod right there. But,
Well, tell him you said that.
I tell him regularly. But just, again, to show that there's a lot of ways that Missouri kind of handled this. And yes, there's an expressed ideal, and then there's reality in terms of how we actually arrange ourselves.
John, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, on schools in general, the very first constitution of the Wisconsin Synod emphasized the pastor's role in instructing the youth. That was just up front. And why there's a Norwegian-German difference there, I don't know. Our church body is very strong on the gymnasium system, but not necessarily originally. The first president of Northwestern College really wanted to make Northwestern the Harvard of the West. And it was August Ernst who really, developed the system that, we would be familiar with in the Wisconsin Synod today. And the college training, I think Northwestern was probably a four-year college by the 1920s, I'm guessing. My grandfather would have gone through with 4 years of prep and 2 years of college and on to the SEM. He graduated from the seminary in 1896, and he would have only been about 22 years old at the time. But he was big on education, and he's one that also pushed for the full four-year college program at Northwestern for our pastors.
And it was a Wisconsin Synod pastor, F.W. Winter, who led the charge in starting Bethany Ladies Seminary. And one of their stated objectives from the very beginning was that Bethany Ladies Seminary was going to be the Vassar of the Midwest.
Of the West, yeah.
That's great.
Well, I stood up at the wrong time. Tom Rank, Bethany Lutheran College and Winnebago County, Iowa. There's been too much camaraderie here, and so even though I'm not known for grumbling, I'm going to do a little grumbling. See my friends in the front there when I say. Anyway, being a lifelong member of a small synod in fellowship with another synod 20 times larger and having broken with one 200 times larger, means that you live in a shadow many times. And what Pastor Firkin said has so wonderfully given to us is a summary of what the ELS is and why some of us get very defensive when we see others trying to diminish that or bring into our synod what is not from our synod. And for example, we're not WELS. Try and get that across to people. We're not. But too many see an equal sign there. Clearly, we have different histories that have led us to a very blessed fellowship, but still, we're not the same. And we weren't the same as Missouri prior to the break. And it's been a blessing for all the synods to have those differences, but I think it's good to note them and to realize why they are there and to cherish, our own heritage so that people like me don't get defensive and start wondering, why are you doing that in our synod? That's not who we are. Don't know if you guys want to address that or not. I'll stop grumbling for a minute.
I'm gonna point that one to John first.
I've never heard you grumble, Tom. Well, it's really a legitimate point. In class, I tell my students that some of our forefathers in the Wisconsin Synod bridled a little bit because there were some in the Missouri Synod that sort of treated us like a poor stepsister. And it wasn't all of them. Billy Dahlman loved our synod. He was a character and worked in Milwaukee there. But, our men chafed under that. And I tell them, don't do that to the ELS. Bigger doesn't mean better. And we are two different church bodies. I know early on when I was teaching too, I would have a student say, well, why don't they just join our synod? And I would say, well, why would they want to? I mean, really, it's healthier to have a couple synods in fellowship with each other, I'm convinced, than having a bigger organization. The bigger the group, the more difficult it is for doctrinal discipline and all kinds of other things. And, well, I'm not taking a shot at Larry. No, that was not a nice chuckle. Nothing intended there, Larry. but he would agree.
Absolutely.
But, you know, having groups in fellowship with each other, I think, adds something. In the Wisconsin Synod, we always think we're so clear when we say something. Well, just because it's clear to us doesn't mean it's going to be clear to anybody else in the world. And these discussions, I think, are very helpful. And in my essay, I mentioned we often say the same things with a different accent. And I didn't know how else to express it, but that's the way it came out of my pen. Because we are saying the same things, but we're getting at it sometimes from a little different point of view and expressing things in different terms. And that doesn't mean we aren't agreeing with each other.
In the 1950 history, Wisconsin Synod, was that Leininger or Leininger?
1950.
50, yeah. And in
51
one
was
of
published.
his chapters begins with, you know, a very colorful little expression about how, or describing something to the effect that the Missouri Synod for years had been beating the Wisconsin Synod over the head, and that's before 1868, and kind of describes the way Wisconsin finally came to its position. But it's pretty colorful language that he uses there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, as the object of the chuckles. Size creates different issues for institutions, as does age. I made the point yesterday that during Benkin's presidency, you're in the midst of this period of unbelievable growth in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and you go from about 1 million members to over 2 million members in a remarkably short period of time. There were two great growth spurts in the LCMS. The first, there's nice growth after the founding up to the point of the predestination controversy, and interestingly enough, at the point of the predestination controversy, when Missouri takes its very vigorous biblical and confessional stand, its membership explodes, which is something to explore. I haven't done that, but it does. It just explodes. And then comes World War I, and there's actually a little dip that's followed by a modest recovery and then flattening out during the 1920s. And then comes the Lutheran half hour, and it takes off again. So you're in the midst of this thing. And one of the other things that John Benkin and his colleagues, and there are a lot of them, one of the things they have to deal with is now what is already a large synod has become huge and is actually a significant church body in American Christianity. I have sometimes, when I'm not in a Missouri Synod setting, called this being a victim of your own success. Because now you have to construct yourself to address the size of the entity. And relationships are more difficult to maintain. Knowing one another drops down to a much more local level. It's just new kinds of challenges that come about. And the way that we decided to do this, and I say we as a synod, was really to take on the form of the modern 20th century, and I use modern very intentionally here, modern 20th century American denomination. We took on that form. We incorporated ourselves in a very intentional way and structured ourselves to reflect that incorporation. And honestly, I don't know what else we could have done. We became extraordinarily wealthy at the same time, and we're confronted with all of these sorts of very, very human issues and matters that had to be, that just had all kinds of, just all sorts of affiliated issues that came alongside them. So much so that very quickly synodical conventions moved from being areas where we talked primarily about doctrine to trying to address the legalities of being this very large, wealthy corporation. Now, is that a bad thing? Not, maybe yes, maybe no, but I don't think in and of itself you can say that's a bad thing. But it created a whole new series of issues that we had to address, and we're still consumed with addressing those kinds of things. So I just put that in there to offer a little bit different perspective on the kinds of pressures that were exerting themselves on Missouri, even as these really, really important doctrinal matters are, and relationship matters with ELS and Wells are going on. There's this whole other set of pressures that come right alongside of that. I'm glad that I'm not John Benkin.
Craig, do you want to address that?
Professor Rank, I think, touched upon something very, very important, and it is a current feel very much within the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. I made the comment that the ELS is not about either the brief statement or this we believe, teach, and confess. We are a group independent in and of ourselves. But because maybe of size, maybe for support, we will often say, well, this is what our sister synod, the Wisconsin Synod, may say. And that can lead very much to being, well, are we becoming like Wisconsin Synod? Are we more of a branch of Wisconsin Synod? You go back to pre-synodical conference days, or two synodical conference days, rather. The big sister, the little sister. And there's still that very, very strong sentiment between the ELS and Missouri Synod. If one has to go to a publishing house, is it going to be Northwestern or Concordia for ELS people? I don't know. But there is still an affinity towards many things that are Missouri and the ELS. So there is a tension within the church body both ways, where we don't always do our own work, where we don't always affirm our individual identity itself. And I think Professor Rank summarized that very well.
No.
One question, though, I do have, and maybe Professor Brenner can answer that, very much in that regard, is a terminology. Prior to the formation of the Synodical Conference in 1872, Missouri Synod and Wells and Wisconsin Synod found each other. They made their declaration of fellowship, of unity. The Norwegian Synod and Missouri Synod, after 1859, kind of formally recognized that bond. What was the relationship between the ELS and Wisconsin Synod prior to the Synodical Conference? Do you have any idea?
I don't, yeah.
You know, the Norwegian Synod with fathers centered in the state of Wisconsin, is there almost mutual ignoring of one another?
And I think it's a language barrier. And, I think Concordia St. Louis was natural because they needed a place and a good reputation with Walther there, whereas, we didn't have anything. And for this essay, I did try and look into that a little bit. I can't find any comments until the Synodical Conference days.
I've never seen anything in the early Norwegian papers that referred to the Wisconsin Synod, because all of if you go looking for Wisconsin, then you run into this Wisconsinism, Missourianism, which those were pejoratives being directed at the Corin and Ottoson and Preuss. But, there's another question that's suggested in this one too, though, and that is the issue of the Synodical Conference. That the Synodical Conference was organized in such a way that Missouri always, it was a proportional vote, so that Missouri could always outvote both Wisconsin and the Norwegian Synod together. And one thing that was learned from that is the very structure now of the CELC, where the synods stand, or the church bodies each have a vote, 2 votes. Yeah, but it's not possible for one body, no matter how big it is, to outvote the others. I don't know. Has the ILC has that done anything like that? Or is Missouri?
It's straight up church body, so it's
Okay, same thing,
not
yeah,
proportional, yeah.
okay.
I'm here.
Yep,
This idea of the different flavors of the different synods depends on the way we talk about it, I guess. I would want to accent moving freely between our synods that are in fellowship. My whole training was Wisconsin Synod. My background, grandfather and father was ELS. But I'm, I'm the only one out of 10 children that didn't have anything to do with Bethany. Nine went to Bethany. I didn't, because I grew up in Watertown, Wisconsin, and I know people like Dr. Brenner, and they were my classmates and so forth. And I like being able to move into the ELS freely and not feel, you know, as I say, I think there's a good way and there's a bad way to talk about such things. Difference between tiger meat eaters and lutefisk lovers or something, and we joke about it, and I think that's probably the right way to handle. How many Norwegians are in the ELS this day and age? Somebody did a study. I mean, and when it comes to pastors, even. So anyway, I come out on that side. Let's not, and I think that was our forefathers.
Yes.
Bug had to learn German. He didn't complain about it. He loved it, and Walther was his favorite teacher of all time. We also, in that regard, we've had people who have gone to all 3 synods, or 4 even, and my high school days. Brilliant guys, Dr. Richard Jonkuntz and Dr. Ralph Gerke. I often said Ralph Gerke was the best teacher I ever had anywhere. Well, time of the break, he went to Missouri. So did Jonkuntz. And they got too liberal for even liberal Missouri, and they ended up at the school that my grandfather founded, Pacific Lutheran University, both of them professors. They're highly respected. Jonkuntz was the president at one time. And Gerke, we used to talk with him when we went out to Washington, just as friendly as can be and all that. But we have had all of that going on too. That was a rambling thing I just said. Not a real point there, just an observation.
My influence, sorry.
Erling, I'd like to comment something.
Yep.
It is interesting, a point that you raise along the way, and that is there is what I've referred to as basically the Norwegian culture of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod today. We don't want to do a number count as to how many Norwegians might be in the Synod. Just as a humorous note, a few years ago, the Norwegian Grove Lutheran Church that I was serving did some remodeling, and the joke at that point in time when the remodeling was done is we don't want to count numbers, and maybe we shouldn't be Norwegian Grove, but we should be the German Hedge. But the heritage, the culture, and many of the things that have shaped us do have this Norwegian heritage to it. But remember the statement of a synod man that would have existed 100 years ago. I put a little different spin on that, referring to the synod person today. That's not someone who just knows who we are, but appreciates who the ELS has been. Because there's a big difference between knowing it, knowing the facts, and appreciating those things and acknowledging the sphere in which we truly are operating and not being at odds within ourselves. And when that is appreciated, it's very easy to make that move between sister synods.
So the Wisconsin Synod lies when it calls itself Wisconsin. The Missouri Synod lies when it calls itself Missouri Synod. And we like to lie too.
We were die Deutsche Evangelische Lutheran Synod von Missouri, Ohio und anderen Staaten.
Back here?
Yeah. So I'm from MLC, Martin Luther College, and coming into here, I was completely ignorant of Lutheran history, like during the 20th century, 19th century, and so I was shocked to see how many mergers were going on in the early part of the 20th century within the Lutheran Church, and so I was wondering, and I'm somewhat familiar with the Wells history leading up to World War I, and all 3 of these synods were immigrant synods. Maybe Missouri was bigger and maybe a little bit more diverse, but what effect did World War I have on this sense of merger or unionism, or maybe even kind of being more separatist, for lack of a better word? And if you have any like specific stories or.
Who wants to start with that one?
I can start with that one. I think the moves to English in the Wisconsin Synod well, it would happen naturally anyway, but I'll tell you, World War I really sped them up. And if you want to read a pretty good account of what was going on at the time of World War I for people in our synod, the Wisconsin Synod Historical Institute Journal a few years back published in a couple issues a good portion of teacher Steve Gergel's master's dissertation, which was entitled "The War to End All Germans." And he got into FBI records and everything under the sun. We had all kinds of our pastors investigated. A couple of them were put in jail. Some churches were either egged or had yellow paint splashed on them. And so I think immigrant groups wanted to become American. And I think even today I hear some in our circle saying we're too German. Well, you ask the Germans, they'll say you aren't German at all, you're Americans. And too many people in America equate Americanism with Christianity. And that's not good. Those two things are not the same thing whatsoever. And yet, as good Americans, we can often confuse those things. But I do think World War I don't know what impact that had on mergers. I think the Luther anniversaries were far bigger than that. But as far as, making us English-speaking, huge.
Sure. It impacted the Missouri Synod in much the same way, and local congregations were affected in basic ways. For example, the congregation that I served as a vicar, Emmanuel in Terre Haute, Indiana, had a day school, a parochial school, and the teacher, their last teacher, conducted everything in German because they were a German congregation. And the people of the city were upset about this. They came in, they rode them out of town on a rail and forcibly closed the school, which never reopened. That's one instance of the same kind of thing that Dr. Brenner's talking about. Missouri had already begun to dabble in English work. Well, it was certainly the case by the early 1850s. Learning English was part of the curriculum at our seminary. Now, how well English was learned, that's another thing, but nevertheless, it was part of the curriculum. By 1872, a group of confessional Lutherans approached Walther at a meeting in Missouri and asked to become a part of the Missouri Synod. He told them, no, you can't because you don't speak German. And oftentimes that's held up as Missouri being kind of exclusivistic in terms of its German language. Well, for Walther's part, he said, we're above our eyebrows in terms of dealing with the immigrants who are flooding in. Why don't you guys form an English Missouri Synod? And they did eventually, and that in time also found its way into the Missouri Synod. In 1911, that became the non-geographical English district of the Missouri Synod. So prior to the outbreak of World War I, we did have an English district. It was relatively small. It grew pretty quickly. But that all said, World War I accelerated what was already beginning. So in about 1917 or so, a third of Missouri Synod congregations were using English in worship. What that meant in most cases was, other than English district congregations, was that they would have an English service once a month, not at regular service time. The vast majority of congregations really weren't using English in a meaningful way. By 1936, so 19 years later, 2/3 of Missouri Synod congregations were using the English language, and it was the language of practice in that majority of the congregation. So you, in a less than 2-decade period, you went from being a German synod to being an English and really an Americanized synod in short order. That's a remarkably short period of time to undergo that sort of basic change, to change the language of the heart from German to English. And these people, they were able to do that. To me, that's really a remarkable thing. Now, it was done under duress. It wasn't always willingly carried out, but nevertheless, they did manage that.
Norwegians being Nordic rather than German, there's a little different influence that took place there. We often, of course, refer to that language issue in regard to Lime Creek Lutheran Church in Iowa. Iowa was unique in 1917 when the Norwegians couldn't conduct their meeting in the Norwegian language. They could have done so anywhere else in the nation except in Iowa. And that's why they were able to walk across the state line a mile north into Minnesota. Whereas many other states banned the use of the German language in public, the state of Iowa banned the use of all foreign languages. So Norwegian was also banned at that point in time in Iowa, and so it was a little bit unique. But what was shaping the Norwegians at that point in time wasn't World War II as much as the rising tide of Norwegian nationalism. Professor Brenner speaks about that on page 13 of his lecture. But in 1397, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark had all been united in what's called a personal union. They all were individual kingdoms, but they shared a common monarch who resided in Copenhagen in Denmark. That relationship continued until 1523 when Sweden left the Union, leaving Norway and Denmark together. Napoleon comes about, and at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Norway is taken away from Denmark and given to Sweden. Denmark had sided with Napoleon, and so that was the treaty arrangement itself. Brief skirmish, after which Norway wrote and adopted its own constitution. Sweden acknowledged Norway's constitution, and Norway acknowledged Sweden's king as their monarch. That was 1814, and incidentally, Norway's 1814 constitution is the second oldest constitution in operation in the world today. The oldest is ours in the United States, and then comes Norway's.
They took Norway away from Denmark, but Denmark got to keep Greenland.
Yeah.
It was the union between the three Scandinavian countries was the Kalmar Union, and but the Swedes got out of it rather quickly, and so finally, when Norway became actually a part of Denmark, it was more by default than anything else.
The king's coronation charter at a certain point in time, because the crown in Denmark was not yet hereditary, part of his acceptance of all of this and dealing with the aristocracy meant, they said, Norway now has to be ruled from Denmark, and the king accepted that as a part of his accession charter, and so it became a part. However, now it's become a part of Sweden, 1814, or they share a king with Sweden, rather. 1905, Norway says that is enough. They've wanted to leave this union with Sweden where they share a common king. 1905, that happens. Norway elects her own king, independent, for the first time since 1397. He happens to be a descendant of Danish monarchy, but elects her own king. That is huge. And you're only about 10 years before World War I. When that happens, Norway's pride, Norway's nationalism just blows up and it explodes. And Norway wants to create a new identity for herself, reaching back to that time before the Union of Kalmar. That's why today we think of the stave churches and trolls in Norway rather than other Scandinavian items. Norway wanted to make herself very distinct from anything Danish or Swedish. All that starts to happen right before World War I. On page 13, Professor Brenner refers to the fact of the Norwegian American societies, the athletic clubs, the musical clubs. All of that is coming together right before World War I. Now, we're singing together in a common chorus. We're sitting together and we're sharing lutefisk at these common meals. We are writing a new hymn book together. Then comes 1917.
But that is a good picture of Norwegian logic, that we're so happy to be rid of those Danes. Hey, Dane, would you like to be our king? Okay. Another one back here?
My name is Tim Erickson. I'm a ELS pastor, recently retired from the mission field in South America. And I appreciated Tom Rank's comments about our identity. And recently I was at a Wells church and at a dinner, and the person I was sitting next with, we were conversing, and he says, I knew at one time there was something called a Little Norwegian Synod. Whatever happened to them? And I was able to say, I'm one of them. I'm a lifelong member too. And on the mission field, we try to keep a synod identity. If people who know the history of our mission field know that we haven't had too many Norwegian missionaries there. And one time in the mid-90s, a new missionary came, and his wife stood up in front of a group and said, I'm so happy to be at the Wells mission in Peru. Well, I stood up right away. I said, this is not a Wells mission, it's an ELS mission. And she got kind of huffy about it too. And so to keep our identity, that's one thing that encouraged me to stay on the mission field for a longer time, so that our missions wouldn't lose the ELS identity that they had down there and become Wells missions. And I want to tell a little story. Maybe some of you were there when it happened, about George Orvik. And I was with George Orvik, and I believe there were other people with us too, and he was telling a story about a conversation he had with President Gerhard Wilde in Germany. And George made the comment after he told some of the things that happened in the ELS history. He said, our history is kind of a sad history. And President Wilde spoke up right away. He says, no, that's a glorious history, contending for the truth. And what I wanted to say was that really was an event that I remember because it changed my idea about ELS history. And I appreciated these papers because pretty much things were positive in talking about the history of the ELS in these papers. And we need to try to be more positive about it and not lament the losses of the past and the controversies that have caused so many problems in the old Norwegian Synod and since then also. And I was just wondering if anybody wanted to comment about that, about whether the ELS history is a sad history or a glorious history.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Galen's going to answer that question.
It's a glorious history. I want to mention something also that President Orvik always emphasized, and it's in Craig's paper, the emphasis on our synod being a refuge. That was a very strong emphasis during his presidency. During that time, I served one parish that was traditionally ELS, and the other parish was a FAL congregation. And what a wonderful home the ELS became for those congregations, and that was it was a wonderful blessing that the Synod was able to take people from the outside and welcome them in and make them part of the organization. That's a wonderful tradition that we have also. That's the speech part. Now, the other part is totally different from that. Rast has said something, and you're Rast too, you know. You mentioned that Missouri changed, you know, in those few years from a German church to a English or American church. It is, to me, it's interesting. That's the same time when many of the difficult theological debates occurred. Interesting correlation there.
Well,
you know what I'm implying.
Well, they begin. I mean, those conversations certainly begin right at the same time, and there are those among the German speakers in the Missouri who are trying to hold on to this, who are saying it's the English that is doing this, and that voice is certainly present. It becomes quieter and quieter as time goes on, simply because of the reality that the German can't be supported. During World War I, the Missouri Synod was really quite outspoken in terms of advocating for American neutrality. And that wasn't unusual. There were other Lutherans German Lutherans, who were doing that. Yeah, exactly. But Friedrich Bente actually testified before the United States Senate and argued for American neutrality during that time, and did so in the English language. But his accent was of such a character that Henry Cabot Lodge actually wrote to Theodore Roosevelt and said, "I did not appreciate being lectured about Washington and Jefferson by a man whose accent was so thick I could cut it with a knife." So the Missourians thought they were fitting in, but they weren't, at least those Missourians. Within that context also, though, you had some really remarkable outreach going on that was confessionally Lutheran in the English language at its best. And here I often use the example of my own grandfather. I mentioned yesterday my mother had the very Lutheran name, very German Lutheran name of Kirkpatrick. How did this happen? Well, her mother's maiden name was Kopacek, which was Americanized Kubitschek. They were Austrians who became, they were Catholic Austrians who became Lutheran in time. And when the Kubitscheks were living close by the Kirkpatricks, well, my grandmother and grandfather, as they became, met one another. And my grandmother, Edna Kubitschek, insisted that before they dated, my to-be grandfather, who was a Scots-Irish member of the Salvation Army. I always thought he was a Presbyterian, but to my shame, he was Salvation Army. She said, "You have to become a Lutheran." He said, "Sure, let's give it, I'm willing to learn." So he was catechized by the pastor at Concordia Lutheran Church on Belmont Avenue in Chicago in the English language. This is in the late 20s. Loved what he learned, became absolutely engrossed with Luther's catechism, and one of the prized possessions that I have, he was a pipe fitter in Chicago, and one of the prized possessions that I have is his personal catechism that he took with him when he worked, kept in his back pocket, folded up, had a heavy-duty cover on it, and then he would pull it out during his breaks and read Luther. He knew the catechism better than anybody I've ever met in my life. He knew, he just, bang, it was there. Much better than I'm ashamed to say. But when it came to the point of, do you desire to be a member of this church? He said, "Are you kidding me? Absolutely." And became a member of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. But he said, "I won't worship in German. I won't do it." And there were he's one instance of thousands and thousands of people who came into the Missouri Synod during this time, many of whom were catechized well, as he was, others who were not as well catechized. And in that, again, that period of remarkable growth that the Missouri Synod experiences, you have that unevenness in terms of preparation for church membership that becomes one of the burdens, frankly, of our Synod later in its history. The proof in the pudding, I suppose, is that you could have a marvelously catechized man coming from who has no background in Germany whatsoever, or any kind of Lutheranism, Scandinavian, nothing. He's a Scotsman, 100%, but he confesses biblical truth, and that defines him in terms of his life as a Christian. Marvelous person, marvelous person. Those were the kind of people that carried that attitude into the future in the Missouri Synod and provide, I think, a marvelous model for us today. We continue to struggle, very frankly, in the Missouri Synod with a wide variety of preparation for membership. That's been a long-term issue for us. It continues to be. It will, I think, for some time to come. But we have these, but the simple fact that English was used was not the problem. It was the willfulness of actually communicating the gospel in its fullness, in all of its articles. And that's really the challenge that remains with us in the Missouri Synod today.
Okay, thank you. Since we're on,
Sterling?
yes.
This is not as a question, but I think there's one thing that should be maybe noted along the way before we conclude at all. President Molstead this morning noted that during our centennial year, there were 4 significant individuals in the history of our synod who have been taken to heaven. One of them being President Orvik, who entered heaven during the month of September. And Professor Brenner, in his paper, or in his presentation on page 22, refers to the formation of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference, and there he does refer at the bottom of that page to the planning committee who did the planning for that first meeting that took place in Germany. And it's very nice that he lists those names. However, I think it really should be noted that the 3 individuals who are of prime importance in the work of planning the actual groundwork of the CELC itself were Gerhard Wilde of the Evangelical Lutheran Free Church in Germany, Wilbert Gaurich of Wisconsin Synod, and George Orvik of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod. And I don't think we should lose sight of those important names in the formation of the Confessional Evangelical Lutheran Conference.
Since in the last minutes we've been talking about the relationship, well, for the last 2 days, the relationship between the 3 synods and dwelling on that history, and we thank our brethren for sharing that with us. And one of the phrases we use sometimes is iron sharpens iron, and that's, I think we've been doing a little bit of that. But I want to say a few words about Bethany Lutheran College and the 3 synods. In 1927, the fledgling Norwegian Synod of the American Lutheran Church bought a little college from an association, not from the Wisconsin Synod, but from an association which was formed primarily, chiefly by Wisconsin Synod pastors and congregations, but there were also quite a few Missouri Synod pastors and congregations in southern Minnesota. And on the faculty, there just happened to be a couple of Norwegians, Holden M. Olson, who was one of the 13 pastors at Lime Creek, and a Torgerson. During the when the Synod took the college over, Sigurd Ylvisaker really had to do a lot of persuading to the timid Norwegians. This is too much for us to handle, and he said words to the effect, "Our Synod needs just such a school to gather ourselves around." And that was the primary purpose of it. But from the very beginning, Ylvisaker and the others in the Synod made it clear that even though this college was for a very important part of keeping this little Synod together, that we still considered ourselves to be a synodical conference school. And so consequently, during the 1930s, and well into the 40s, even through the 40s, probably there was a majority of students who came from the Missouri Synod, but pretty strong representation from the Wisconsin Synod during those years as well. Then in the 50s, as the Synodical Conference was crumbling, the leaders of the college, the Board of Regents, leaders of the Synod were really getting short fingernails. Because they saw that if there was a disruption in the Synodical Conference, this could mark the end of the college. They sent, many people went out trying to raise money for scholarships to get young people to come to the college. My uncle Bjarni was able to persuade Robert Preuss, who was a young pastor in our synod at the time, to see if he could get some money for scholarships. And Robert Preuss was able to get a farmer in northern Minnesota to fund the first couple of years of school for me and my sister. And that story was told a lot. Now, there are a lot of Missouri Synod pastors at the time who refused to send their students to the college anymore, although the Wisconsin Synod pastors started to really pick it up and the population from the Wisconsin Synod grew greater. But this was suggested to me when he talked about Orvik talking about our synod as a refuge. During the next years, it was amazing, even though we didn't get rich or anything like that, the students did flock in, especially from conservative Missourians during those years. So all the time that I was in high school and college here at Bethany, there were an awful lot of Missouri Synod students who just simply couldn't hack, their parents couldn't hack sending their kids off to some of the Missouri Synod schools. And yet, some of our strongest support at that time was coming from Missouri Synod pastors sending their children. So that's another aspect, it seems to me, of the cooperation, the life that the former Synodical Conference churches shared. And then even after the disruption of the Synodical Conference, there were still lots of gatherings. The free conferences where the Wisconsin Synod men, the men from the ELS and from the conservatives from the Missouri Synod were gathering. I was at 2 or 3 of those. And there were some frank talk from time to time, but nonetheless, it was, if it wasn't a love fest, there was the camaraderie that had always been there was still there. And we hope that we see that again, and we hope that we'll be able to come together again with some of our other brethren who were part of that disruption. So we thank all of you for being here. Thanks to our speakers today. Very enlightening and stimulating papers, and I always like it when I can talk church history with you guys. Please note on the program at the bottom of the back page, the proposed topic for next year. We are working on that in our committee. Lutheran preaching through the centuries. Just exactly how that's going to be divided, that's still a mystery, but it will be revealed. And the dates are October 31st, so we're back to Halloween. Oh, I mean Reformation. We will be celebrating the Reformation. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Godspeed on your way home.